Hello, Charles.
How you doing?
Good.
Okay. Let's see. Close a few windows here. Hey, Billy. Let's see. I don't think he's got his sound on. Good morning, Betty. How you doing? Bernice.
Good morning. Hello.
All right. It keeps moving. Oops. Hey, Billy.
Yeah,
Hey, how you doing this morning?
all right. I put Linda on my computer here.
Right.
Hers.
Yeah. Well, why I saw you, I just wanted to kind of catch you and say hello. I hadn't talked to you in a long time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back together and getting some things done.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Good seeing you. All right. So here we are, and it is Wednesday, and we are talking about this thing called painting and mixed media. Okay. And some of you guys have sent some stuff in, and I think earlier in the week had requested that maybe I, show some African American artists who.
Let me let you turn up. It's your computer.
Okay, Linda, I'm going to mute you. Okay.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
All right. So anyway, I'm gonna show some of the work. There's a fellow by the name of Henry Ossawa Tanner that she had requested. But I also have some work by another African-American artist who I want to show as well. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things going on in the world and some of the reactions to some of the art that's being made these days, and particularly within the last couple of years. And there seems to be a lot of turmoil, okay? Geez, okay, let's see. Anyway, because it's one of those times right now. And one of the artists, one of the artists I wanted to show you happens to be really one of my favorite artists generally, just as a painter, just because of how he sort of evolved and his work evolved and changed over time. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with him. And his name is Hale Woodruff. Okay. Has anybody ever heard of Hale Woodruff before?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah, he's not one of those names that a lot of people really know very well. And it's a shame because his work is really diverse. And if you think about artists like Pablo Picasso, for example, Pablo Picasso started off as a very traditional artist and then over time evolved, and his style was always changing. And pretty much so the same was true with Hale Woodruff. And Hale Woodruff, I think he was born around about 1900. And he died in like 1980. Okay, so he had a fairly long life, and he was very prolific. He did a lot of work. He particularly did a lot of work during the time of what we call the WPA, and he did a lot of murals. Okay, so I'm going to show some of his work, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, and then we'll talk about Henry Ossawa Tanner as well, and then I specifically want to talk about Chuck Close before I leave here today, just because Ilan did a piece, and it reminded me immediately of Close's work. So we'll kind of go through all of that. Okay. Let's find. So I got a bunch of stuff to share with you guys today. So the image that you're seeing right now, this is a piece by the artist I was talking about, Hale Woodruff. And now this is one of his, I would say, later pieces. And it's, in fact, you know, I was talking about Pablo Picasso, and in a sense, this is kind of a direct response to Picasso's Guernica and the bull in Guernica, if you think about it. Now his figures at this stage are a little more representational. You can clearly see a bull. You can see a female figure riding on the back of the bull. And this piece is called Africa and the Bull.
Oh.
Okay. But I'm going to show you a whole variety of his work. Now, what he's probably best known for, this is a mural.
Oh. Okay.
And this was about it had to deal with an incident that happened on a slave ship coming across, and they revolted against the crew. And so this was a piece about that. And it's a mural. I think it's somewhere, I think in Minnesota or somewhere like that. Maybe Minneapolis. Here's a piece, and this is a very large mural, and this was done back at the time of the WPA. Okay, so he was a very young man, you know, when
I like that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's
like
got
those.
some beautiful work,
Yeah.
and if you begin to look at the range of his work, he has so many different approaches to it. As you'll see, you know, his late work became almost totally abstract and non-representational. Again, you know, part of the same project, a different mural in a different area. But again, you know, look at the treatment, look at the color, the figures, and he has a way of, you know,
Yeah, I like that.
yeah, stylizing his shapes and forms, but his use of color.
Yeah,
And
I
you
like
know,
color.
as you know, you've got a mixture of all kinds of different cultures. Anything from Mesoamerican to African to Neolithic.
Go back to the one before just a moment, please.
You mean this piece right here?
The one right there. That looks like Lady Liberty or something.
Well, I think this has to do with sort of like classical culture, like Greek, Roman culture versus African. And then down here you have, you know, contemporary modern art, African art. I haven't really looked at this piece. You got a Mesoamerican piece right here.
Okay.
It's definitely Aztec, Inca, something like that. So.
And it's also blended. Different generations are here, because look at the guys with the ties on.
Yeah.
Compared
Different
to the
modes of
other
dress,
ones.
different periods of time.
Yeah.
So he's putting art, you know, and the different cultures, you know, in sort of a historical context. You know, he's telling a story here. You know, and you know, most public art, and particularly WPA period, which WPA lasted, it was from, I think it was like about 33 through about 42. Okay, artists were working under what they call the WPA. WPA was like a huge, it was Roosevelt's brainchild to basically put Americans back to work at the end of the Great Depression. And some of those people he put back to work were American artists. And so they did a huge amount of building in the national parks and different monuments. Well, and actually some of those monuments that we're tearing down today, of things like some of the Confederate generals and things like that, Christopher Columbus, all of those were actually commissioned in like the late 1930s, 1940s, and erected, as an homage to our history, okay, as a nation. Now, and that's a discussion we'll get into later, but, from generation to generation, your view on and the context of art changes. And it depends on who's seeing it, and how they're interpreting it. Okay. But we'll get
Are
into
these basically murals that were done like in courthouses and bus stations and libraries?
Right. Yeah. Actually, even New York has a couple of his, they're made out of mosaic, but in a couple of the stations in New York City, he's got several pieces there as well. Okay.
And Charles, this is Janetta. I think this is the same gentleman whose artwork is at the bus station in New Orleans.
It may be. Yeah, it's Hale Woodruff.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. And like I was saying, for me, he's one of my very favorite artists. And it's because if you look at artists and how they evolve over time, he, a lot like Picasso, went through these major shifts and changes in direction, in the type of work that he was doing and how he kind of interpreted and saw the world around him and the changes that it went through. But anyway, moving on. Okay. There's another WPA project mural. And, these are big. I mean, these are really, really big pieces of art. Okay. So, they're not small. So as you can see, during that period of time, he was working, very representational. And, his style, kind of was, it was fairly typical for that period of time when you look at some of the other murals and things that were being done. A lot of them kind of fall into that style or vein of work. And then this is one of his later pieces when he was much, older. And, again, he's gone almost totally abstract with these pieces. But the thing is, again, he's still taking those references of other cultures, patterns, textures, colors, things like that, and he's reusing them and reinterpreting them at a different stage of his life. And again, there's the bull, it's called, well, this one is titled Europa and the Bull. But the original drawing that I showed you was Africa and the Bull. Again, another abstract piece. And this one is almost figurative, you almost see two figures moving in there. And he was very strong figurative artist. He could draw very well. He had a good understanding of the mediums that he was using, how to achieve depth and movement, in his work. Again, there's a very large mural. Okay. And this had more to do with, it's like the forming of the unions in this country, which happened right around about a little after 1900. there were some riots in the Northeast in some of the factories. Some of the workers wanted to organize and start unions. And actually, I can't remember who the president was at the time, but it was one of the rare times when U.S. troops, actual military troops, were used, against the U.S. public, and it created quite an outrage. And in fact, it got the union movement started in this country as a backlash, kind of like we're having a backlash today against, police violence. So some changes were definitely made, and we kind of went through this period where, things got better for a while for workers. Okay. Here's a woodcut of his. And then I wanted to show you this drawing. And, you look at this and it's figurative in a sense, and it's still very abstract. And again, this is one of his much later pieces. And I saw this painting, and it's a fairly good sized painting. And it's in the Chicago Art Institute. And out of all the things that I saw in Chicago, and there was a lot there that was really, really great stuff. This was one of my favorite paintings. And I can tell you right now, the color that you're seeing there on the screen, it just doesn't quite translate, to the intensity and contrast, that's actually in the actual original painting. So, but it's a beautiful piece. Another woodcut of his. And then there he is as a young man, working on, one of those murals. Yeah. So that was Hale Woodruff. Okay. And then I'm going to show you Henry Ossawa Taylor, or Tanner, I'm sorry. So we've got chat. Okay. And then we're going to talk about something maybe a little, what? Okay, that's close. Where? Here he is. Okay. Where'd you go? Trying to find him now. I know you guys can see it on the screen. I'm trying to dig through all the windows I've got open here.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So this is Henry Ossawa Tanner. And I think Tanner was born in about the 1870s or 1880s, probably about 1870s. And he was African-American. He traveled throughout the U.S. For quite a while. He was a fairly, successful artist at the time. And then he expatriated and went to France. But he also, in his travels, traveled through North Africa and through the Middle East. And so a lot of he's got a pretty wide range of subjects. Definitely what you would call a traditional representational painter. Okay. So this was from 1879. And just kind of keep a watch on those dates and see how his work, it shifts a little. And what I noticed about in looking at a body of his work is it's very reminiscent. You can tell the things that he was producing as concepts and ideas. They were preliminaries, for larger pieces, that he wanted to do. And so the preliminary work like this piece was either done what we call alla prima or plein air. And you know, in looking at a lot of these, some of them look like they're probably water media, probably not watercolor, but probably like gouache or something like that he could work with very quickly, you know, on location, because they have that sort of liquidy water look to them. But they're more solid and opaque than a watercolor. So I'm guessing that this is probably gouache or tempera, and it was probably done, you know, in a sketch pad or a board or something. And you know, again, use of contrast, color, you know, really quite nice. And you know, the difference between, you know, these kind of concepts and then his finished work were very different. Again, you know, this is probably, again, you know, a water media and not, you know, not an oil. And again, you know, it looks fairly preliminary. It's more or less an idea. It's not a real tight, refined, finished drawing. But for those of you who use water media, I want to point out a couple of things about his work. He gets some very, very dark values, okay? But, and this was done in 1917. He had been to France, lived in France for quite a while at that point. And I think he was strongly influenced by the Impressionist painters that he met there. Because in his early work, you see pretty clear evidence where he would actually use black, you know, or a mix, you know, an actual black from the tube, you know, in his early works. And once he went to France, he pretty much eliminated black from his palette. And all of those darks that you see in these paintings, really from about, you know, right around about 1895 or so forward, you know, what he's doing is he's actually mixing his blacks. He's using, you know, those primary, secondary colors to make those strong darks. And the advantage of doing that is that you can control temperature of those dark areas better than just with like a commercial black, which tends to be very cold because it has a lot of blue in it. Yeah. Booker T. Washington. It was a portrait that was done in 1917. I really like this painting, you know, the composition of it. Now this was a larger, more finished, and I think it was probably an oil. But again, you know, you look at how he uses the paint and how he uses the brushwork to begin to describe like the movement of the water, the form, you know, actually of the boat itself. You know, he doesn't just lay that in as a solid dark. You know, he takes and he follows the form with those brushstrokes to really tell you what the volume and the shape of that boat is. So, so really strong, you know, effective painter. Again, you know, another probably larger oil. And again, you know, look at the brushwork and how he lays, you know, his paint strokes down to sort of describe the actual form of those waves. And they have this very sculptural feel to them. You know, they don't feel flat in any way. Now this was a piece, it's called Christ Learning to Read. He did a lot of paintings that were sort of biblical in nature, which would have been, you know, fairly typical. There's one of the paintings that he did. And again, you know, if you look at this piece, it's kind of sketchy, kind of preliminary. So again, you know, it was probably done, you know, on site for the most part. And, you know, it's a study, you know. He's exploring, he's learning something there. The same is true with this piece. You know, again, you know, it's rather quick. But, you know, really good, strong contrast, good understanding of shapes, had a good way of capturing the sense of light and where the light was in the composition. Yeah. And there's, there's the more, finished painting, I think. Yeah. Again, and he has, at this point, he's right on the borderline, of really being abstract, in the work. Again, nice color contrast. And yeah, this is an earlier piece. And you can see that strong use of black in here and how it for some reason, it just doesn't have quite the life in it that a lot of his later work had. Again, about the same period of time. So, yeah. And that, again, looks like a sketch or a study. Now, I thought this was an interesting piece because it's almost, it's almost a commentary. You've got this situation where people, are at the zoo and they're, looking at this lion who's in the cage, and it's kind of almost like a social commentary to me. Let's see. This piece, very pastoral. Again, nice figure study. And again, look at how the brushstrokes are laid down. Particularly like in her face, and how they again move around the form. They're not these straight lines. They move around her jawline and her cheek and her forehead, and they help sort of describe the form that he's seeing there. Study of the lion. Is a male figure. So he's very accomplished artist. Now that looks, again, like a water media, and this could be a watercolor. It looks a little more like watercolor. And this is up actually around Highland, North Carolina. And it's got one here. I think it's this one, yeah, okay. And again, this is another scene in Highland. And I know exactly where this is, okay? I've been there. And actually this peak right here and this valley in here, that's what they call Rabun Gap. And I've been up there many times and painted in that area. And, so I'm very familiar with that area. And this was, 1889. So it's just before he went to Europe. And this is in Georgia. It's called Georgia Landscape. Okay. And this one, I believe, was in France. No. It's 1891. Yeah, another landscape. See, that's a very kind of traditional genre painting. So he did, a pretty wide variety of things. This is a study, and it's for the bagpipe lesson. And I really like this painting, just as it is. Just the energy, the movement of it. It looks very direct, almost abstract, but at the same time, you get a sense of the story and you know what's happening. And I'll show you the, well, here, I'll skip down to it now. Whoop. Because we're running out of time. Oh my God. Yeah, this is the final painting. And when I look at the study and I look at the final painting, I really like the study much better. I really do. This one doesn't seem to have, I mean, it's kind of a novel story, but it doesn't seem to have the energy that, you know, the actual study had. Let's see. Yeah, this is another one of the landscapes. And again, you know, probably painted plein air or alla prima. And again, the use of the color, the brush strokes, again, you know, has a lot more energy to it, you know, than the final work. Here's another figure drawing. So, and I think this is probably his.
Well, I know that one. I didn't know
Right.
who painted it, but I know that work.
Right.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
seen
I
that
think
one
this
too.
is probably the one that, you know, when people think of his work, this is the one that they remember the most.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful piece, and we could sit and talk all day about this piece, just because there's so much that's really nicely done and right about it. You know, when you look at the use of value, but also temperature, you know, it's one of those paintings that has everything that you want to see. You know, the placement, the composition, you know, the movement, you know, through the piece, the color, the contrast, you know, all of that's working really, really well. And, you know, if you wanted to study painting in general, you know, again, this is one of those pieces of work that you could, you know, you could just learn from, you know, by either trying to emulate and or to just sit and study. You know, it's like, how did he do the things that he did with this? You know, because I mean, it breaks a lot of those rules that most people, you know, think of. And, you know, when you start looking at where the light is, you know, it's not on the figures, you know, it's back here in the background, right? But it sets up this beautiful contrast between the figures, you know, sitting, you know, more or less in some light, but, you know, still some very strong, deep shadow, you know, on the forms, right? Let me blow that up a little bit. And then you look at the little boy's face, right? And look at the color on the light side of his face, okay? Versus, you know, the reflected light, you know, on the shadow side. And the same is true with the man here versus the light. And when you look at the light, all of the color is cooler in temperature. The shadows are warmer in temperature, right? And that's, you know, a pretty common thing to see, where shadows are actually quite warm and the light is cool, versus what most people think. You know, most people put a lot of warm color in the light and cool colors in the shadows, but that's not always the case. And it really works to great effect to really help you get a sense of the volume, you know, and how the form turns, you know, the faces, and even the problem of the hand here. So some nice stuff going on there.
Last night I was watching the Antique Roadshow, and someone had found a painting by, I think his name is Emmett Bannister.
Okay.
And this small painting, it was maybe a 10 by 8 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it went for like $5,000.
Okay.
And so I looked him up and looked at a lot of his work. He's got a lot of landscaping,
Mm-hmm.
but very nice oils.
Okay. All right. Who is this, by the way?
Oh, this is Wanda. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I heard the voice. I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you know, it's really kind of funny. Antiques Roadshow is like one of my all-time favorite shows I used to watch. And the reason I used to love to watch it, because every once in a while people would walk in with these paintings and have little or no idea as to who painted them. And it'd be, a fairly well-known either, artist from somewhere in the world. And some of the actual value of those paintings was amazing. So anyway, we're down to 4 minutes, but anyway, yeah, beautiful landscape. Look at the use again of color warms, cools, really just nice contrast and things. So, and I've got a lot more work of his that we could look at. But before we do that, I want to move on just real quickly, okay? Because I wanted to show you, we talked about, and I'm going to talk about Chuck Close when we come back this afternoon, because that directly kind of relates to what Elan is doing right now. And I also want to talk about some of the work that you guys are doing. But I wanted to share 2 pieces of artwork. And it has something to do with the fact that right now, the whole country's kind of in turmoil. We've got a lot of protests and things going on. And
Talk fast, they're going to cut you off.
Pardon?
They talk fast, they're going to cut you off.
Yeah, I know. We're ticking on down here. But there's, a backlash even in the art community about conversations about racism. And I wanted to show you 2 pieces of work. And so the first one I'm going to show you is the piece of work itself that got a lot of the backlash. Okay. And I can't see it. Let's see, where did it go? There we go. Okay, yeah, we got about 3 minutes. Okay, now this painting was done by a woman in New York. Her name is Dana Schutz, or Schutzman actually. And it's in reference to a killing of a young child. He was about 14 years old. His name was Emmett Till. And I think it was down in Mississippi. Anyway, she had done this painting. It was the Whitney Museum who included it in a show. This was back in 2016. And it created quite a backlash. I'm going to show you, and particularly from, African-American artists. Let's see. Okay. So here's a young artist, okay? And this is his protest against that painting, okay?
I don't know where I'm looking at.
Pardon?
Is that the head or something?
Well, that's his artwork of him standing in front of the painting. And there were a group of African-American artists, and this was back in 2016, at the opening of the show, who had these T-shirts.
Well, what's the round thing that's in the painting? I don't know what that is.
Well, that's a copy of the painting, or his representation of the painting. So that would be, the boy's body laying in the casket, right? And that's him standing in front of the painting. But he wasn't the only one. There were about 20 or 30 African-American artists who showed up at the opening, to protest, the Whitney even showing this piece of work. And again, this is long before, these protests started happening recently. But there's been an ongoing conversation about, what's appropriate to talk about and who can talk about it and who can't talk about it. And, that it gets to be kind of a dicey subject, but that's something that, if you're open to talking about it, I'd like to hear some of you guys' opinions about, some of the art that's being produced. And, are there rules? Are there ground rules? Should there even be ground rules? Why should it not be open? Because again, it's like, you know, this woman who did the original piece of art, she was making a commentary on racism and what had happened back in